What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Game Night YouTube channel. In today's video, guys, I have a tips and tricks video for you for the Mint Tin game Tin Helm by Jason Glover of Grey Gnome Games. So, whether you are a beginner to Tin Helm or a seasoned veteran, you might be able to learn some tips and tricks from this video, guys. So we're going to jump right into it. First, we're going to start out with some of the trappings. Now, these are the items that you start with in the game depending on which class you choose when you start your new character. So, you've got the cutlass and the mace here. If you play as the Skull Keeper, you'll get access to the cutlass, and if you play as the brute or the parson, you'll gain access to the mace. So, the first thing I want to point out, this isn't a major tip, but it's definitely something to look out for and consider when you're making your character. The cutlass overall is just a better item. So if we take a look at the cutlass here, it says that when in combat against an enemy that is not undead, you inflict an additional 1 damage on successful hits. And then if we look at the mace, it says when in combat against an undead enemy, you inflict an additional 1 damage on successful hits. So they both essentially do the same thing. The cutlass deals an extra damage against enemies that are not undead, and the mace deals an extra damage against enemies that are undead. And of course, if you look in the bottom right corner of the enemy cards, there are 8 that come in the game. If it has a little skull symbol, that means the enemy is undead. There are only 3, the Skelepede, the Wraith, and the Doom Skull, that are undead. So the mace will deal 1 extra damage to 3 of the enemies in the game. On the other hand, the Spider, the Dark Rats, the Possessor, the Mimic, and the Watcher, they are not undead. They're just regular enemies, and the Cutlass will deal 1 extra damage to them. So if you use the Cutlass, 5 of the enemies will get 1 extra damage dealt to them, and if you use the mace, only 3 will get 1 extra damage dealt to them, which just makes the cutlass better overall. So if you play as the Skull Keeper, you'll get the cutlass. If you play as the brute or the parson, you'll start with the mace, and for this reason, bar the rest of their stats, the Skull Keeper has just a little bit of an edge because you get to start with that cutlass, and over 50% of the time, you're going to get the effect of this weapon, whereas if you choose the brute or the parson, less than 50% of the time, you'll get the effect of the mace. And while we're on the topic of starting trappings, it's worth noting that the axe is the strongest starting weapon in the game. So you've got the mace, the cutlass, the axe, and on the flip side of the mace is the dagger starting weapon, and the axe is by far the best one because the axe lets you re-roll all doubles in combat, so you can't miss. Normally when you roll doubles, you miss your attack. With the axe, you will literally never miss, and it has a bonus effect. As if that's not already good enough, you can throw the axe by discarding it to roll 2 dice and deal damage equal to the sum of both dice, making the axe extremely powerful. And there's only one class in the game that starts with the axe trapping, and that is the Marauder, making them extremely powerful because you start with the best starting weapon in the game. And now we're going to get into some of the loot cards that you can find in Tin Helm. So the first tip here is about the ring and the wedge. Both the ring and the wedge allow you to avoid combat with an enemy, and there are 3 main enemies that you never want to use these cards against: the Mimic, the Dark Rats, and the Possessor. The Mimic is probably the lesser of the 3. Of course, it's better the deeper you are in the dungeon because you'll get more favored depending on what dungeon level you're on, but you get stuff. When you fight the Mimic, you get stuff. It doesn't have any nasty effect like a lot of the other enemies do that drain your health or let them attack first or drain your energy, all that kind of stuff. The Mimic is just an upside. It gives you stuff. It gives you favor. So you don't want to ring past or wedge past the Mimic. And of course, same thing for the Dark Rats. It gives you stuff. It gives you food when you defeat the Dark Rats. So of course, if you're in a very dire scenario and you think you're about to die and you don't have energy, sure, use the ring or use the wedge. But in all other cases, you don't want to use those against the Mimic or the Dark Rats, and especially the Possessor. That's the main one, and it's pretty obvious because when you defeat the Possessor, you gain a shard, and you need those to win the game. So try to save your ring and wedge against the other 5 enemies in the game. The 3 best enemies to use the ring and the wedge on are the Watcher, the Doom Skull, and the Spider. The Watcher will drain 1 energy from you before the combat even begins, making him a prime target to use the ring and wedge on. He also does an extra damage, and he has 1 toughness, which blocks damage, so that makes him, like I said, a prime target to skip past with the ring or the wedge. Also, the Doom Skull, he always gets to attack first, which is pretty gnarly, and the Spider will make you lose 1 energy every time it successfully hits you. So of course, as mentioned, if you absolutely need to, it's always good to use the ring or the wedge, But for these three, it's pretty much a guarantee that you want to use the ring or the wedge to skip past these guys. Now we're going to move on to the dungeon map cards. There are several of these cards that have some little tips and tricks that you can use depending on what situation you're in the game, and there are some that are just pretty much guaranteed always useful. So one of those is the stash. It's very tempting to choose the stash because it's got a treasure, right? It's like, ooh, there's treasure. I want to go to the stash. You should always skip the stash. And the reason being is because if you skip the stash and you flip it over, on the flip side, there's a shard as one of the loot. So if one of the next cards that you draw that you flip into and you push your luck into, if it has a treasure chest, you get a shard. This is the only card in the deck, the stash, that has a shard as one of the treasure that you can get. So you always want to push your luck past it. And even if you don't get the shard, if you have to fight an enemy, it's dark rats, which will give you food. If you run into a trap, it does 0 damage to you. And if you run into a special event, it's the altar, which is going to either give you health and energy, or if you have 10 plus favor, you'll gain a shard. So always skip the stash. The next room that you always want to skip is the Sanctum. It doesn't look like a place you'd want to go anyway. There's a trap and an enemy to fight, and you always want to skip it. And the reason is because when you flip it over, the enemy you can fight is a Possessor, and the Sanctum is the only map card that has a Possessor on the back as an enemy. And of course, when you defeat a Possessor, you get one of the shards. As you can see right here, the Possessor, when you defeat a Possessor, you gain a shard, and of course, you need those in order to win the game. So you always want to skip past this. It is a little bit brutal if you run into a 2 energy trap, if you have to fight a Doom Skull, or the Mimic isn't so bad because you can get favor from him, but it's so worth it because there's a Possessor. So always skip past the Sanctum. The next room you pretty much always want to skip, and it feels bad sometimes because it's got that random event, which is very tempting, and it's got a campsite, which is usually pretty good. But when you skip the clearing, on the flip side of it, as the random event is the shrine. And if you go to the shrine as your special event, you're going to get yourself a shard. As you can see right here on the shrine event card, you gain 1 shard. So heading into the flip side of the clearing, if this comes up as your first card, always just flip it and skip it and hope that you'll get this random event that'll take you to the shrine so that you can gain 1 shard. If you run into an enemy, there's a Skelepede, not the end of the world. If you run into a trap, it only does 0. And if you run into treasure, you'll pick up the symbol loot card, which is a very, very good loot, and we'll get into what you can do with this soon enough. Next up, we have 3 rooms here that you're going to want to skip if you have 10 plus favor on your favor tracker. The stash has showed up once again. You're always going to want to skip that one anyway. The other 2 that join it are the waterfall and the grotto. So if you have 10 plus favor, or if you have the symbol, which we just mentioned in the last tip, and you have 8 or 9 favor, always skip the stash, waterfall, and grotto. And the reason is because when you flip those over, you can see that their special events are the altar. And of course, if you have 8 or 9, when you have the symbol, if you have 8 or 9 favor and you go to the altar, you'll gain a shard. Reason being, it says that when at the altar, you may gain the reward 1 level higher than what your favor would otherwise indicate. So when you have 8 or 9, you're at this level, but if you have the symbol, you can get the level higher up, which is the 10 plus. You can gain yourself a shard. And of course, if you don't have the symbol, but you do have 10 plus favor, always skip these so that you can go to the altar potentially and grab yourself a shard. So once again, that's the stash, the waterfall, and the grotto. Next up, we've got the corridor. This is a good room to skip because if you flip it to the other side, you'll see that you have the chance to find yourself a turnip in the treasure chest. And of course, the turnip says that you can trade this to the pigman to gain yourself a shard. And that's going to lead into the next part of the tip here, which is we've got the sewers, the lost tomb, and the quarters. If you have the turnip, you're going to want to skip past the quarters, the lost tomb, and the sewers. And the reason being, when you flip those to the other side, you can see their random event is the pigman. And of course, as just mentioned, when you visit the pigman, you may trade a turnip with the pigman for 1 shard. So first thing you got to do, skip the corridor so that you can get your hand on a turnip. And then once you've got it, skip the quarters, the lost tomb, and the sewers, and find yourself a pigman and get yourself a shard. Another great room to skip is the waterfall, and this one's a little bit tempting not to skip because it's got that random event, which I always like to go for the random events. I think it's just the uncertainty of it. It's very fun to me, and it's also got food that you could possibly find. But if you skip the waterfall, on the flip side, if you find some loot, you'll get the sword loot card, and the sword is the best weapon in Tin Helm. It says, you no longer miss in combat when you roll doubles, and when doubles are rolled, you now deal 5 damage. That is insanely powerful. It's very similar to the axe starting weapon, which goes to show how crazy the axe is as a starting weapon, because when you roll doubles during combat, you may re-roll. That's essentially what the sword does, except when you roll doubles, you just deal 5 damage, which in my opinion makes it even better than the axe. So yeah, you're going to want to skip past the waterfall if you can, and hope that you find a treasure chest and grab yourself the strongest weapon in Tin Helm, the sword. Next up, we've got the statue. The statue is a great room to skip because if you check the other side, you've got the ring as a possible loot card here, and the ring is the most powerful loot card other than the sword. Outside of the weapons, the ring is the most powerful. It says that once per dungeon level, you can spend 1 favor to avoid combat with an enemy. That is unbelievably good. That is such a good item, and if you want to get your hands on it, if you're at the statue room, skip right past it and cross your fingers and hope that you find a treasure chest and grab the ring. Now we have a dungeon map card that you don't want to skip. So all the previous tips were about dungeon map cards that you do want to skip past, and this one is the chasm, and you don't want to skip past it. You might be thinking, why? You have to fight an enemy at the chasm. Well, if you skip the chasm, you have to fight a wraith potentially. There's a 2 energy trap. The random event is a skelepede. It's a fight, which sucks. And the loot is an empty chest, which really sucks. So the reason that you want to skip past this, not only because the events on the other side are mostly terrible, you also have 5 chances to fight a possessor. So you've got the possessor right here on the back of this card, and then you also have 4 other cards that have random enemies, which could potentially be a possessor. So you essentially have 5 chances to fight a possessor, and also you've got 6 chances to fight dark rats, which are the easiest enemy in the game, and they give you food. You got these 2 cards right here that have dark rats, and then of course the same with the random right here. You could potentially run into dark rats. So that's like, what? That's 6 plus 5 is 11. That's like 11 chances to fight enemies and either gain food or potentially gain a shard. So you always want to go to the chasm. Now we're going to get into the race and class cards and go over some tips for those. So first off, we've got the Half Folk. The Half Folk starts the adventure with the Ring loot card, and the Ring, of course, allows you to skip past encounters once per dungeon level. If you play as a Half Folk Druid, you'll start with the Charm Trapping also, which says that you can charm dark rats, which essentially is like evading fights with dark rats. Also, if you're playing with any of the expansion content, or if you own Tin Realm, you can add in all the other races and class cards and their trappings, and I'm including those in these tips. Of course, if you don't have those, you just don't have to worry about that part of it, but if you do, you're in luck because I've got tips for you guys too. The other good class to play as with the Half Folk is the Seer, because you start with the Crystal, which says that you may spend 3 favor to avoid a trap, or more importantly, 4 favor to avoid a combat, which means that the Half Folk Druid or Half Folk Seer can avoid combat the most out of any character in the game. So if you want to play a very rogue, stealthy type character where you're staying out of combat, the Half Folk Druid or the Half Folk Seer is the way to go. If you choose the Human as your race, the Human can get access to both the bedroll and the books if playing as an adventurer or a druid, which makes resting at the 4 campsites especially powerful, because with the bedroll, you'll gain 1 extra health when you rest at a campsite, and with the books, you'll gain 1 extra energy when you rest at a campsite, meaning you're going to gain 3 health and 2 energy every time you rest at a campsite. That is extremely powerful. And of course, you could do that as the Human, because the Human may select 1 extra trapping card of their choice from the remaining cards before beginning their adventure. So if you play as an adventurer, you start with the bedroll, potion, and dagger. So you can choose the books as your extra trapping with the human. And if you play as the druid, you start with the books and charm, so you can choose the bedroll as your extra trapping if you play as the human. And that's going to make resting at campsites extremely powerful. You'll be very tanky because you'll be healing up so much, and you'll have plenty of energy to dish out attacks in combat. Now we're going to take a look at the human once again. So if you play the human as the sentinel or the brute, you are an absolute tank. If you play as the sentinel, you start the game with the Iron Helm trapping, which mitigates all damage by 1. And of course, with the human's ability to start with any trapping of your choice, you can choose the bracers. Now, if you pick the brute, you start with the bracers and you can choose the Iron Helm as the human. And the bracers say, you may block an incoming attack by spending favor equal to the amount of damage your foe is dealing. So this turns you into a tank that can soak up all kinds of damage, and as a bonus, if you happen to find the quarters and you skip past it and you find yourself a loot, you can grab the shield, and the shield essentially does the same thing as the Iron Helm. It mitigates 1 damage. So picking a human sentinel or a human brute will get you a ton of armor, and you can block so much damage, more than any other character in the game. And if you have Tin Helm and any of the extra class and race cards, you also have access to the Construct, who essentially is like the human sentinel or brute. Now, you don't have the human's ability of getting to choose an extra trapping. So if you play a Construct sentinel, you'll start with the Iron Helm. And if you play a Construct brute, you'll start with the bracers. But the Construct has it built into his ability because it says that Constructs reduce damage from attacks by 1. So it's like he's already wearing an Iron Helm. And of course, the same tip still stands that if you find the quarters and you skip past it, you can grab yourself a shield to be extra tanky. Now we're going to take a look at the gnome race card. So the gnome can gain a lot of food, guys, because gnomes perform both actions at the campsite instead of having to pick one. So when you're at a campsite, you get to rest, which gains you health and energy, and you get to search for provisions, gaining of food. So the gnome always has food on hand. He's going to be packed with food. So this makes him an ideal pairing with the Ranger class card. Go figure, a gnome ranger. Reason being, the Ranger class card allows you to start with the Raven trapping. And the Raven says, once per dungeon level, you may spend 1 food to skip your enemy's turn to attack. So normally this is a pretty steep cost if you're any other race, because food is very valuable. But as the gnome, anytime you find a campsite, you don't have to decide whether you want to rest or gain food. You're always going to do both, and you're always going to have food on hand. So playing as a gnome ranger makes the Raven especially powerful, and it makes the gnome the perfect pairing with the Raven. Next, we're going to take a look at the Hedge Mage class card. So the Hedge Mage class card has 4 very ideal pairings: the Catfolk, the Construct, the Dwarf, and the Dweller. And the reason being is because as a Hedge Mage, you start with the trapping, the Amulet, which says instead of making an attack during combat, you may instead deal 2 damage and spend no energy, and you gain 1 bonus favor and 1 health. And so it's great that you don't have to spend the energy to do the damage. You gain some bonus health, but most importantly, you gain 1 bonus favor, and that is perfect for these 4 race cards because their abilities require favor in order to use. As the Catfolk, you can spend 3 favor to skip a room in the dungeon and gain an energy. As a Construct, you reduce damage by 1, as mentioned earlier in an earlier tip, but most importantly for this tip, you can spend 3 favor to add 2 damage to an attack before rolling dice. So you get buffs to your attack as the Construct when you spend favor. If you're a Dwarf, the Dwarf may spend 1 favor to re-roll his attack dice. So if you don't like what you rolled really poorly, you can spend that 1 favor and re-roll. And as the Dweller can spend 2 favor to gain an energy. He can also spend 2 favor to re-roll the enemy's attack dice. So this makes pairing all 4 of these race cards with the Hedge Mage armed with the Amulet very, very powerful. And finally, for the last tip, we've got the Wood Elf. The Wood Elf says when resolving the Grove, the Wood Elf gains 1 favor, and she may also spend 4 favor to escape the Labyrinth. So as a Wood Elf, if you ever find the corridor, the crawlway, or the statue room, it might be wise to skip past them, because for the random event on the other side of all 3 of these rooms is the Grove. So that will proc the Wood Elf's ability that says when resolving the Grove, the Wood Elf gains 1 favor. And then once you build up that favor, you can spend 4 of it to escape the Labyrinth. So if you happen to run into the Catacombs, the Endless Pit, or the Kitchen, and you end up pushing past them and you run into the Labyrinth special event, after going to the grove so much, you'll have built up all that favor and you can go ahead and skip past these. So be sure to skip past the statue, the crawlway, and the corridor as the wood elf to find those groves and gain yourself some bonus favor. And there we go, guys. Those are all of my tips and tricks for Tin Helm, the Mint Tin Dungeon Crawler game by Jason Glover of Grey Gnome Games. Guys, if you learned anything new, be sure to put that down in the comments below. I'd love to know if you learned any tips or tricks from watching this video. Also, if you have any other tips or tricks of your own that weren't mentioned in this video, please let us all know by putting those down in the comments section below. Also, hit that thumbs up like button, click the red subscribe button, and click the bell to stay notified every time I upload brand new videos. And guys, until next time, have a good one, and I'll see all you dudes in the next video.